Good evening. I would like to welcome everyone to this evening's program. My name is Kwok. I teach at the Episcopal Divinity School. I have the honor and delight to introduce Professor Taves, who will deliver this year's presidential address. Professor Taves has been alternating between studying science and studying religion since her undergraduate day at Pomona College, where she majored in religion and prepared for a career in medicine. After a year in medical school, she withdrew to pursue what was for her a less practical but more compelling interest in the study of religion. Receiving her doctorate in the history of Christianity from the University of Chicago in 1983. Since that time, she has continued to move between different and sometimes conflicting intellectual worlds, gradually finding ways to make clearer distinctions and promote deeper understandings between disparate points of views. As professor of the history of Christianity and American religion at Claremont from 1983 to 2005, she taught students to shift back and forth between theological and religious studies perspectives. Since her appointment as Professor of Religious Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara in 2005, she has been working to foster collaborations between the humanities and the sciences. She's also working to build bridges between professional organizations, serving in addition to her duties as president of the AAR on the steering committee of the International Association for the Cognitive Science of Religion, and as a newly elected member of the executive committee of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. She's the author or editor of 4 books and numerous articles, including Feasts, Trances, and Visions, Experiencing Religion and Explaining Experience from Wellesley to James, from Princeton University Press in 1999, which won the Association of American Publishers Award for Best Professional or Scholarly Book in Philosophy or Religion in 2000. And Religious Experience Reconsidered, a building block approach to the study of religion and other special things, also from Princeton in 2009, which recently won the 2010 Book Award from the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. In these 2 books, she has positioned the history of Christianity and the study of religion more generally, not at the center of her inquiry, but as one partner in an interdisciplinary conversation. From an intellectual space between disciplines, she has used the topic of experience to examine the history of competing discourses about unusual experiences, and in her most recent book, to examine the psychosocial processes that lead some people to set some experiences apart as sacred or religious, or more broadly, as special. As a fellow at the Center for the Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford for the 2008 and 2009 academic year, she began work on a new volume on revelatory events while enjoying the opportunity to observe the academic culture of the social sciences at close range. Tonight, she draws on this broad range of experiences in her address, entitled Religion in the Humanities and the Humanities in the University. Please join me in welcoming President Taves.
Thank you, Puilan, for your introduction, and especially for highlighting the different positions I've held and the roles that I've assumed, both institutional and intellectual, over the course of my career. I also want to thank the Critical Theory and Discourses on Religion group and NASSER and the editors of two journals, Method and Theory in the Study of Religion and Religion, for sponsoring a series of very stimulating conversations over the past year that have pushed my thinking forward in some very helpful ways. And so some of you who were in those conversations will see bits in here that were originally responses to various things that you said. But in these conversations, one of the things that kept coming up was repeated questions about my position and point of view. And at times, I felt like I was supposed to adopt a fixed position with respect to a set of familiar binaries, which you should all recognize, between being a scientist or a scientific point of view and a postmodernist point of view, between being a critic and being a caretaker, between being religious and being non-religious. A set of binaries that you might catch from that introduction are not ones that I want to choose one from each of the following two choices. So in reflecting tonight on the study of religion in the context of the modern North American university, I don't plan to position myself in one place, but rather I'm going to shift between three different points of view. I'm going to speak in turn as scholar of religion and AAR president, as a historian, and as an advocate of increased collaboration between the sciences and the humanities. And in doing so, I want to make the case that our perennial difficulties with two basic problems, specifying our object of study and figuring out how to study it, actually present us with some real opportunities. Let me begin by considering the problem from a vantage point inside the discipline in my presidential role and as professor of religious studies. As most of you know, the National Association of Biblical Instructors renamed itself as the American Academy of Religion in 1963, the same year that the Supreme Court issued its ruling in the Schempp case and launched a period of rapid proliferation of departments of religion, especially in public universities. A few years ago, the AAR conducted a study of the religion major in a wide range of types of institutions with the support of the Teagle Foundation to try and figure out what had happened over the 50 years that had passed since the AAR formed in terms of understandings of what it meant to major in religion. The working group found that over the last 50 years, and I quote, "A remarkable consensus has emerged among religious studies programs in almost every setting, public, private, denominational, and secular, regarding certain core concepts that are widely viewed as essential to the religious studies major. Among other things, according to their report, we agree that the religious studies major is, by its nature, intercultural, comparative, and multidisciplinary. Religion majors study, quote, the phenomena of religion across and within cultures from a variety of theoretical and methodological disciplines." Okay, so I'm rehearsing the obvious here to make a point about our discipline. Like political science and art history, ours is a discipline that is defined by its object of study. Fields that are defined by their object of study tend to be what a colleague described, he was in political science, described as raider disciplines when it comes to theory and method. We borrow whatever seems useful relative to our subject matter from wherever we can find it. Such disciplines, to maintain their existence, continually return to definitional questions. What is religion? What is politics? What is art? Subject-oriented disciplines stand in contrast with disciplines that are defined by a level of analysis, such as physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, and sociology. These disciplines typically bring common methods and theoretical assumptions to a range of phenomena at specific levels of analysis. So, for example, the subatomic in the case of physics, mental processes primarily of individuals in the case of psychology, or group processes in the case of sociology. Although many of us in religious studies may grow weary of the interminable attempts to specify our object of study and can feel overwhelmed by the variety of methods that we can bring to bear on it, there are losses and gains in both kinds of disciplines. Biologists, psychologists, and sociologists have the luxury of shared conceptual approaches and levels of analysis within their respective disciplines, but they are typically not trained to work across disciplines and often are hesitant to venture into unfamiliar territory for which there are few academic rewards. As a result, we not only have different academic cultures in the sciences, social sciences, and the humanities, but we also find different mindsets in disciplines defined by their subject matter in comparison to those defined by theories, methods, and levels of study. The question I want to raise tonight is how we might take collaborative advantage of these differences. So let's start with our subject matter, our object of study. I don't think I have to rehearse the problems we have faced as a discipline with respect to specifying our object of study. These are well known to us, as is the default scholarly solution, stipulating a definition of religion for the purposes of a particular research project. In stipulating definitions, we tacitly acknowledge and attempt to get around the underlying problem that is dogging us, the historical instability of our object of study. What we and our subjects refer to as religion, religions, traditions, the sacred, magic, the occult, superstition, folk beliefs, fetishes, and so on, implicitly embed claims about what is or ought to be valued. These claims, more often than not, can be located at sites of struggle, where people contest the meaning of events and make claims about what matters most to them in the overall scheme of things. If our object of study is unstable and shaped in important ways by the point of view that we and our subjects bring to it, then I think we should give up attempting to solve the problem of defining religion by offering stipulated definitions. Stipulated definitions of religion artificially stabilize our object of study and obscure what I believe we ought to be studying: the processes whereby people decide on the meaning of events and determine what matters most. Calling for a focus on process in the sense of asking what counts and for whom is not a new idea. But I think we can push it farther. If we focus on the process, we can start by describing the site or event we are going to analyze in very basic, generic terms. For example, two people corresponding, a small group talking, a crowd looking at something, and so on. No one would be satisfied with this level of description because it leaves out everything that matters, including claims about what really happened. But that's the point. What really happened, what it really means, and whether or why it really matters is precisely what is contested, and thus what we have to elicit from those involved in the activity from their point of view. Thus, we can go on to ask a series of questions. What claims are disputants making about what happened or is happening? From their point or points of view, what forces, powers, or agents had the power to act in this situation? Who or what caused things to turn out as they did? How do they know this? What resources did they draw upon to make their claims? What kind of evidence do they offer to account for what they think happened? What, from their point of view, counts, matters, and is at stake in this activity or event? How much does it matter? This series of questions shifts our attention to what people think is or should be happening, how they know, and why it matters. What we as scholars think of as religions, philosophies, paths, and here I'm referring to the Sanskrit term marga, could be construed as more or less formalized, more or less coherent systems of valuation that people call upon consciously and unconsciously when making claims regarding what happened, what caused it, and whether or why it matters. They are not, however, the only systems of valuation and may be drawn upon by some, but not all, participants in an action or event. Nor are highly elaborated, formalized, and coherent systems required for people to make such judgments. Indeed, I would suggest that the more formalized and coherent systems stand in explicit tension with less coherent, but more pragmatic, more automatic, seemingly intuitive processes of valuation. People constitute the things that matter to them by marking them as special relative to other things in their class and ranking them as more or less special on continua, ranging from the ordinary to the totally singular. Through processes of singularization and desingularization, people move things back and forth along such continua, positioning them in relation to other things and at the same time debating their placement with others. People use this process to constitute the things that matter to them in a variety of different domains, not just the domains that scholars might want to consider religious. If we're interested in tracking processes of valuation as they unfold over time in various domains, we can position ourselves as historians, that is, as scholars who are not bound to any particular subject matter, and track those processes wherever they lead us, whether into the history of religion, science, politics, sports, etc. If, however, in addition, we want to explain how processes of valuation work, we need additional tools. In our theory and method courses, at least the ones I know about, we typically offer our students an array of explanatory options, drawn for the most part from psychology and sociology. We usually offer these explanations serially as theories of religion. First Marx, then Durkheim, then Freud, then Weber, then Malinowski, etc., down the line. We happily embrace these disparate perspectives, which is good, but I think we can aspire to something more. Rather than simply borrowing theories and methods from other disciplines and turning our departments into fragmented microcosms of the larger university, I think we can take advantage of the fact that we can approach our object of study at many different levels of analysis and take up the challenge of figuring out how we might relate explanations generated at different levels of analysis. To do so, we need to specify these levels of analysis more carefully, specify whether we are looking at the levels over time, that is diachronically, or in time, synchronically, and consider where culture fits in from both perspectives. Viewed from the diachronic perspective, and I mean largely diachronic, the perspective of evolutionary, historical, and developmental time, we can distinguish between molecular, cellular, organismic, and social levels of analysis. At the molecular or genetic level, we share much in common with other animals. At the biological level, we have much in common with other mammals. And at the social level, much in common with other primates. Here, though, I think we need to distinguish, following Bruno Latour and Maurice Bloch, among others, between the face-to-face social and the institutionalized social. If we define culture, and here I'm following Richardson and Boyd, as, quote, information capable of affecting individuals' behavior that they acquire from other members of their species through forms of social transmission, it's evident that while culture is not limited to humans, it plays a much larger role in human behavior than in any other species. The vastly expanded role of culture is linked to the human ability to create elaborate institutional formations, including universities and professional associations such as ours, which reproduce systems of valuation from one generation to the next, independent of face-to-face interaction, or without totally depending on face-to-face interaction. If we shift now to a synchronic point of view, we can still speak of different levels of analysis, from the micro to the macro, that is, from molecules to cells to organisms to groups, but where diachronically the levels layer one upon the next over time, synchronically the levels appear as nested circles that constantly interact. Thus viewed synchronically, a molecule or cell or organism or group is part of a larger set of systems, each of which constantly interacts with its environment. From a synchronic perspective, and I know this may sound a little odd, culture is not at the top level of a stack, but at least in the case of culture creating animals, an ability that shapes and is shaped by each of these levels, from the molecular to the group. Thus, insofar as cultural information is learned and neurons interconnect in ways that reflect what we have learned, cultural patterns are expressed at the micro level of neural processes, as well as at macro levels of individuals and groups. So, as a subject-oriented discipline, we have the luxury, which other disciplines do not necessarily have, of exploring how our subject matter, or better yet, the processes that lead to the formation of our unstable subject matter, work at different, albeit connected, levels of analysis. This is an ability that I think at least some scholars in subject-oriented disciplines can and should cultivate as a contribution to larger collaborative projects. I want to illustrate how we might take advantage of these two opportunities, the instability of our object of study and our methodological, as I call it, promiscuity, in each of the next two sections. In this section, I will use the making of our own discipline to illustrate how we can turn the historically evident instability of religion as an object of study into an opportunity to understand the way that processes of valuation shaped the formation of disciplines within the modern university. I do so as a historian, not as a historian of religion, but as someone who has at times passed as a regular historian. From this vantage point, I want to suggest first that scholars divided religion as an object of study among several different content-based disciplines within the university and excluded some aspects altogether based on systems of valuation to which many of us no longer subscribe. And second, these divisions and exclusions have stabilized these valuations and obscured the underlying processes of valuation implicit in the process of disciplinary formation. The modern research university, with its familiar threefold distinction between the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities, emerged during the latter part of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th. There were three key periods in which academics debated the place of the study of religion in the modern university: the turn of the last century, the 1920s, and the mid-20th century. The turn of the century was a period of intensive disciplinary formation, particularly in terms of what we now think of as the natural and social sciences. This is the period, too, in which scholars who are viewed as the founders of anthropology, sociology, and psychology, such as Marx, Tyler, Fraser, James, Freud, Durkheim, Mauss, and Weber, wrote many of the classic texts that we assign in theory and method courses in the study of religion. During this turn of the century period, some scholars thought that the scientific study of religion, which they understood to mean modernist, evolutionary, scientific, and shorn of theology and devotion, could replace the old moral philosophy as a means of uniting the curriculum and promoting a, quote, new, more effective form of religious education. Some universities, including Yale, the University of Chicago, and Berkeley, even tried to build programs in religious studies based on the scientific study of religion back at the turn of the century. But the programs were, in the words of historian Julie Rubin, and I had to laugh when I read this, they were plagued by student indifference. So they failed to get off the ground. Okay. So then by the 1920s, as scholarly interest in the scientific study of religion declined, administrators located the study of religion outside the regular curriculum, along with theology and devotion, and promoted them all as extracurricular activities. The threefold division of the university curriculum into the natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities took its final shape during the period in which the study of religion was more or less in exile from the formal curriculum. Humanities were the last of the three cultures of the tripartite curriculum to coalesce, in part because they were highly fragmented and diversely aligned. As scientific disciplines, however, promoted themselves increasingly as value-free, the humanities, led by literary studies, emerged in the 1920s as the promoter of values and subjectivity, in formal opposition to the value-free objective sciences. The study of religion made its comeback as a discipline from the extracurricular margins in the 1960s, a comeback that was signaled by the name change from NABI to the AAR. Even though departments of religion developed relatively late, both the first and second periods left their mark on our present-day self-understanding. The role of the Protestant university-related divinity school and extracurricular campus ministries in shaping departments of religion that emphasize the theological disciplines, Christian theology, biblical studies, and church history is relatively well known. It's this model that the newer conception of the religious studies major has sought to replace. We know, too, thanks to the work of Tomoko Masazawa and others, how the study of Christianity and other religions in the theological curriculum gave rise to the idea of the world religions. We have not, however, sufficiently considered the disciplinary legacy bequeathed to us by the scientifically oriented scholars of religion at the turn of the century. Now, in making this claim, I don't mean to suggest that we haven't examined many of these figures at great length. Rather, I want to suggest that we've not paid sufficient attention to the assumptions about religion that were shared by many of these scientifically oriented scholars of religion, and that, as a consequence, informed the way that religion is studied in the modern university. Several lines of thinking converged to give the study of religion its characteristic shape. The widespread agreement that magic, science, and religion were distinctly different things. The recognition of different types of religions. And the idea that mysticism constitutes the core of religious experience, which in turn lies at the heart of religion. As Randall Stiers has shown, though classical figures such as Tyler, Fraser, Durkheim, and Mose distinguish between magic, science, and religion in different ways, they all assumed that these distinctions could and should be made. Moreover, though they made these distinctions at the height of a revival of interest in magic and the occult among the educated classes in both England and France, they nonetheless subsumed the occult, if they mentioned it at all, under the heading of magic and associated magic with the primitive. The net result was a disciplinary division of labor, at least in the US, in which anthropology studied religion in primitive cultures, including animism and magic. Folklore studied primitive survivals among the folk in modern civilized societies. In this context, anthropology has produced a prodigious literature on shamanism and spirit possession, what in a modern context we refer to as spiritualism and Pentecostalism, that is largely disconnected from religious studies, while folklore has developed techniques for studying orally transmitted beliefs and practices that we now belatedly consider in religious studies under the headings of popular and lived religion. In addition to noticing how things got divided up, we also need to notice how this division of labor led to noteworthy exclusions. So, for example, until recently, esoteric forms of religion have stood outside the purview of the academy. This is especially surprising given the links between key figures such as Eliade and Massignon in the study of religion and esotericism. The same has been true of movements among educated elites, such as spiritualism, the occult, and New Age movements. Finally, research on so-called paranormal and psychic phenomena, pioneered by the Society for Psychical Research, has remained an odd quirk with no real place in the academic landscape at all, although Jeff Kripal and a few of us are working on that. These distinctions and excisions fit nicely with the distinctions between types of religion prevalent at the turn of the century. The 19th century witnessed a gradual transition from a fourfold distinction between Christians, Jews, Muslims, and everybody else, to a twofold distinction between world religions and local religions that's common today. The program of the Third Congress of the History of Religion, held in Oxford, England, in 1908, with E.B. Tyler as honorary president and R.R. Merritt as secretary, names I hope you all should recognize as the first and second holders of chair in anthropology at Oxford, highlights an intermediate threefold distinction between primitive, national, and universal religions that was common at the turn of the century. Of the 9 sessions at the Congress, 1 was devoted to papers on religions of the lower cultures, 6 were devoted to religions of various geographically defined peoples of the world, and the 8th session was devoted to the Christian religion, geography unspecified. The 9th to method and scope in the history of religions. In this threefold distinction between the religions of lower cultures, religions linked to particular peoples and or regions, and what in other contexts scholars forthrightly described as the, quote, uniquely universal religion of Christ, we see the role that comparative theology, or what today we would call theologies of pluralism, played in the development of the history of religions and religious studies as it is now institutionalized in departments of religion. Here, too, the net effect is obvious. Most departments of religion today reflect this mixed heritage of comparative theology and history of religions and devote most of their resources to the study of the world religions, which we define based not on logic, but on what J.Z. Smith aptly called a sort of pluralistic etiquette. And we also devote time to area studies, which allows us to avoid references to the religions of peoples. Okay. So then the next idea, the idea that mysticism is the core and center of religious experience, fit inside the world religions idea and provided a means of linking the world religions. This idea, which depended on the promotion of a narrowed understanding of mysticism, arose in tandem with the psychology of religion at the turn of the century. The narrowed definition was promoted in explicit opposition to a more inclusive understanding of mysticism embraced by a spectrum of folks that scholars viewed as somewhat problematic. At one end of the spectrum, we find occultists, theosophists, and spiritualists who embraced research on trance, hypnosis, and dissociation as the basis for constructing their esoteric practices and entering into alternate spheres. Adherents of these schools blurred the boundaries between magic, mysticism, psychical research, and experimental psychology, and were more than happy to do so. In the somewhat more acceptable middle range, we find mystically oriented psychical researchers such as Frederick Myers, who viewed psychology as the link between science and speculative mystical thought. Moving to the right, we find Catholics with esoteric leanings, such as the so-called decadent novelist Walter Huysmans, and Catholics drawn to apparitions and what were referred to at the time as the mystical phenomena of mysticism, i.e. stigmata, levitation, odors of sanctity, and other such phenomena. William James' chapter on mysticism in the Varieties of Religious Experience, which came out in 1902, and the Protestant theologian Ralph Inge's book, Christian Mysticism, published in 1899, both can be read as explicit responses to the blending of occultism, mysticism, and popular Catholicism. Though I suspect James would be appalled at the way readers essentialized his foremarks and divorced mysticism from the psychopathology that he viewed as its other half, scholars routinely use his stipulated definition of mysticism to narrow its scope, shear it of occult, pathological, and popular overtones, and locate it within the context of religion in general. The visual depiction of the shift from the broad definition to the narrow definition in 1900 and 1909 was not created for this lecture, but for a paper I gave in August on controversies that arose at the 4th and 6th International Congresses of Psychology held in Paris in 1900 and Geneva, Switzerland in 1909. Historians haven't typically connected these two controversies, since the first involved psychologists, psychical researchers, and occultists who were studying spiritualist mediums, that is, modern, well-educated British and French animists. And the second controversy at the 1909 meetings involved clinicians, psychologists of religion, philosophers, and theologians who were all studying religious experience. The rapid scholarly embrace of a narrow definition of mysticism obscured the continuities between these disputes. If we take the narrow definition into account, however, we can see while the overt focus of controversy at the two congresses shifted from the study of mediums to the study of religious experience, the underlying issue, whether scientists could study the relationship between mystical claims and psychological processes, remained the same. The point, then, of this section is that religion as an object of study and the disciplines that study it were constructed at the turn of the century based on claims about what is or ought to be the case regarding religion. The turn-of-the-century congresses, whether of psychology or the history of religions or any number of other emergent fields, were sites of contestation where people with different kinds of training advanced different views of what these disciplines should study and how they should study it. The process of disciplinary formation thus was shot through with valuations. It could not have been otherwise. And our criticisms of them pretty much boiled down to disagreements over how things should be valued. Is Christianity uniquely universal, a singularity that stands apart from all the national religions? Or is it simply one world religion among others, that is, no more special than the rest? And if we reject the idea of primitive and civilized, are there ways to talk about matters of scale and complexity without valuing the global over the local or vice versa? And what about magic, the occult, and the study of Western esotericism? What about relics, amulets, and other objects written off as fetishistic or superstitious by most at the turn of the century? Most of us, many of us at any rate, have made our careers challenging the valuations of our forebearers and reclaiming all this stuff for the study of religion. Though James most likely did not anticipate or intend the effects of the definitions that he stipulated for the purposes of his lectures, many 20th century scholars latched on to James' definitions in order to set religious experience and, above all, mysticism apart as special. Others, such as Otto and Eliade, made it yet more special, going so far as to protect it, at least on some readings of their work, with prohibitions and taboos against comparing or mixing them with other things. We can understand the critical backlash against Eliade and others as an attempt to make religion more ordinary. A central question underlying debates about our object of study and the methods we should use to study it, thus has to do with its singularity. How special is religion? Can it be studied like more ordinary things? Rather than jump into this debate over how special religion is, I want to explore what a consideration of various levels of analysis might add to our understanding of the process of valuation itself. At this point, I'm taking off my historian's hat and I'm putting on my interdisciplinary, crazy advocate of the cognitive science of religion hat. So prepare yourself. Okay. In order to work across levels of analysis, we have to confront, I think, another ghost from our past: evolutionary conceptions of religion. Many of the classical theorists adopted a stage theory of evolution that presupposed a teleological movement from the primitive to the civilized and tacitly culminated in some sort of singularity, whether Christianity or Western civilization. We need to distinguish, however, between the stage theories that infused late 19th century scientific views of religion and the neo-Darwinian evolutionary synthesis consolidated during the mid-20th century. The latter, which synthesized breakthroughs in genetics with the Darwinian ideas of random variation and natural selection, allowed us to distinguish between genetic and cultural evolution. In terms of genetic evolution, most evolutionary psychologists assume that we do not differ cognitively from our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Moreover, insofar as humans acquired genetically evolved capacities that allowed the far more rapid processes of cultural evolution to take off, most modern evolutionary theorists would not view the process in terms of teleologically driven stages, but rather as competitive cultural adaptation, varieties of cultural adaptations to particular environments. The stage theories of evolution that shaped our discipline and modern neo-Darwinian understandings of evolution understand mental processing in fundamentally different ways. Where biocultural stage theories depicted primitive thought as something that could and should be superseded by civilized modes of thought, genetic evolution conceives the human brain in terms of interactive levels of processing that range from the non-conscious to the highly reflective forms of consciousness. Non-conscious and automatic forms of mental processing, many of which we share with other animals, are very fast, pragmatic, and time-tested. We rely on the far slower, reflective, or metaconscious, meaning when we're conscious of being conscious, those forms of mental processing in which we take so much pride, we rely on them for only a fraction of the things we do. Much as we may gain from these expanded levels of awareness, we could not function without the intuitive, spontaneous, and practical forms of mental processing that previous generations characterized as childlike and primitive or animalistic. This understanding of mental processes has direct implications for explaining processes of valuation. That is, our perceptions of and claims about what matters most to us. This process, which goes on all the time in human communities of various sorts, cannot be equated with religion or religion-like things. Though all of us inevitably participate in the process in one way or the other, the level of awareness and intentionality that we bring to the process varies from moment to moment. Insofar as we are aware of the process, we can make conscious choices about what matters most and decide how we want to engage in the process reflectively. But the process does not take place exclusively at the level of self-conscious reflection. Both as scholars and human beings, we lace our texts, conversations, and behaviors with implicit valuations. Nor are these valuations hidden. Adult humans, pre-linguistic kids, and other animals can and do enact processes of valuation. Because the process does not take place simply at the level of discourse, we can only understand parts of it through the analysis of speech and texts. To understand the process more completely, we need to understand how it works at various levels of awareness, how these levels relate diachronically, and how they interact synchronically. Let me pause at this point to acknowledge that I'm now stepping across the humanities sciences divide, but I'm doing so in a way that acknowledges the value of both perspectives. This is the kind of place where I'm not ready to make the choices some people seem to want me to be making. So stick with me here, because my goal is not to reject the humanities for the sciences, but to build bridges and make connections. In crossing over into scientific territory, I do not want to discount the importance of culture or language or textual studies, or by extension, deconstructionist approaches to understanding human beings and the worlds we inhabit. If, from a social constructionist perspective, anything can be set apart as special or singularized, that does not preclude the possibility that there are species-wide tendencies to set a few things apart as special, culturally specific tendencies with respect to others, and random or idiosyncratic variation with respect to the remainder. Establishing statistically significant probabilities through empirical observation is not the same thing as postulating essences or declaring things to be naturally or biologically determined. Moreover, it's easy to imagine how statistically significant probabilities might inform the social construction of claims regarding natures and essences. Just as historical and comparative perspectives provide our primary window on the variation and stability of cultural forms across times and places, so too evolutionary and developmental perspectives provide a window on the similarities and differences across species and across the human lifespan. Though all human valuations undoubtedly have a biological and a cultural dimension, looking at processes at various levels from both synchronic and diachronic perspectives would suggest that some processes of valuation are more deeply rooted in our evolutionary history than others. Given this, we might hypothesize and could empirically test to see if the level at which a behavior is rooted makes us statistically more likely to set some things apart than others. I will highlight two. Mother-infant bonds, the tendency of mammals to bond with their offspring, and thus set their own particular offspring apart from all others. And play, in which many species create special spaces in which alternate roles and scenarios can be enacted as if real. So taking the first, insofar as mammalian mothers bond to their particular offspring and not to other infants that to us probably look just the same, then this bond illustrates one very basic way in which mammals set their infants apart from all other infants of their species. This undoubtedly involves a range of processes, including hormonal changes, neurotransmitters, and various sensory cues: smell, sound, touch, and vision. If you saw March of the Penguins, you saw how the parent penguins sing to their baby penguins to find their particular penguin through their particular song. In highlighting the biological aspects, I do not mean to imply that the biological factors are determinative. Adoptions clearly demonstrate otherwise. But they do suggest that mammals are able to set some things apart as special without recourse to language, in contrast to what many of us in the humanities would tend to assume. Play is another interesting example. Though the boundaries of what counts as play are disputed in the literature, it's clear that a wide range of animal species play. To do so, they have to signal their desire to play. They have to be able to convey a distinction between playing and regular, ordinary behavior. This is a mock fight. We're not going to really fight. When we add in some more specifically human abilities, we get pretend play. That is the ability to enter into a specially marked space in which we co-create alternative realms in which we are bound by agreed upon rules specific to this space. Let's play this, and you can't do that. You have to do it this way. This is how we're going to play it. Some researchers speculate that pretend play is the context in which children first practice the skills that prepare them to negotiate complex cultural institutions. In making up the rules that govern pretend play, young humans learn that specific rules can govern particular spheres of activity, and by extension, how to enter into the culturally specific systems of valuation that govern particular cultural activities and institutions. My point is simply this: developmentally, the ability to engage in complex cultural activities is layered on top of more basic processes, such as capacities for attachment and play, with which they constantly interact. These capacities and the mental processes associated with them are not mere survivals of our archaic past, but swift, efficient, time-tested systems of evaluation and judgment. We do not decide that our kids are special. They just are. We don't decide that it is fun to play. It just is. We can override these judgments to some degree using slower, more reflective mental processes, but in most cases, we probably cannot and would not want to eliminate them. The process of formation that led to the current consensus regarding the religious studies major cannot be traced to any one theorist or institutional base, but drew from a range of sources to create what for U.S. scholars, at any rate, seemed like a plausible object of study. Nonetheless, as institutionalized in departments of religious studies and anthropology, there is still a sense in which the Victorian stage theory of cultural evolution lives on in the institutionalized division of labor between departments of religious studies and departments of anthropology. To leave that legacy behind, we need a more nuanced understanding of evolutionary theory and a clearer understanding of levels of mental processing. Insofar as the classical theorists of religion associated the so-called lower religions with more natural, intuitive, and spontaneous systems of evaluation that they denigrated as superstitious or primitive, they limited their ability to see these same time-tested systems of evaluation at work in themselves and their educated peers. If we choose to focus attention on processes of evaluation in whatever context or time period, we should expect to find an interplay between faster, more intuitive, and slower, more reflective forms of mental processing. Insofar as these more basic processes of evaluation are deeply rooted, we should not expect that they will go away. Their shape will just shift with cultural fashions and in response to more elaborate systems of evaluation that attempt to subordinate them to ostensibly higher values. So let me conclude by putting back on my AAR President, Professor of Religious Studies hat, and also my graduate advisor hat, and say what I think all this means for departments of religious studies, especially those that are involved in graduate education. First, understanding processes of evaluation can be approached from many directions and will need to be a collaborative effort. Knowledge of particular languages, cultures, and traditions of reflection on what matters most is a crucial component of the collaborative task. This is the bread and butter of religious studies departments and something we would give up at our peril. 2. Insofar as we want to describe and analyze these traditions of reflection as a part of a process of evaluation, we can focus on sites of controversy where people's assumptions about the meaning and value rise to the surface. We should not expect that disputants would necessarily view themselves or the sites of contestation as religious. We can select sites where some, all, or none of the participants characterize what matters most to them in religious or religion-like terms, depending on what matters most to us. In setting up studies, we should formulate our own claims in the active voice. These are all issues that we can take up in our courses on method. Third, and finally, we can attempt to explain what is going on at these sites by offering explanations of how the process is working at multiple levels, from both synchronic and diachronic perspectives. This is an opportunity that is open primarily to fields defined by their subject matter and will require that we prepare at least some of our students to collaborate with others outside the humanities. Opening ourselves to the interplay between biology and culture at multiple levels has the potential not only to enrich the study of religion, but also to build bridges between the sciences and the humanities in ways that could enrich the university as a whole. Thank you.